I'm Taylor, and I'm here to help you learn how to sew all kinds of bags, from small organizing EDC pouches all the way up to bigger bags like slings, totes, and backpacks. This is part one of 2 videos I'm doing for a complete beginner. In this first video, we're going to talk about fabric, zippers, thread, webbing, tools, cutting, and marking fabric. The next video, part 2, will go over basic machine setup and actually start sewing your first seams. The 2 videos go together, and I would encourage you to watch both if you're a beginner and just figuring things out. If you want to learn how to make your own gear and don't really know what to do, this is a great place to start. Let's get going. The first thing we should talk about is fabric. It's helpful to know a little bit about fabric before we start trying to make something with it. There are 2 sides to every piece of fabric, and in sewing terms, one side is the right side and one side is the wrong side. It's really important to know which side is which, because your patterns will often call for certain sides of fabric to be put together before sewing a seam. With this little gray pouch, the right side of the fabric is the side that will be on the outside of the finished project, and the wrong side of the fabric is the side that will be on the inside of your finished project. Using this EcoPack as an example, it's pretty easy to see that the right side of this fabric is this nice medium gray. This side is the right side. It's abrasion resistant, so you want this to be on the outside. And then this side is coated with a waterproof layer that's not that abrasion resistant. So you would want this to be on the inside, which we would call the wrong side. You can see I did that here on this pouch. I put the abrasion resistant fabric on the outside, the right side, and the not so abrasion resistant layer on the inside, which we would call the wrong side. If you aren't using a technical fabric with specific layers like the EcoPack, then some of this is arbitrary. I had a sewing teacher who always said the right side of the fabric is the side that you like the best. So I've made entire backpacks out of the wrong side of denim, but I wouldn't necessarily do that with the EcoPack or the X-Pack or the nylon Cordura fabric. Fabrics come in different weights, typically measured in ounces or grams, and it's generally how heavy a square yard of fabric is. So this is a 6.9 ounce EcoPack. If you cut a square yard of this fabric, it should weigh about 6.9 ounces, and that's what that means. Sometimes technical fabrics have other numbers, like their denier number. You often see this with woven nylons like these from Cordura. These are some pouches that I made a while back. This is a 500D Cordura. This is a 1000D Cordura. The bigger the number, the heavier the fabric. Let's talk a little bit about fabric preparation. If you're using synthetic fabrics like these for your bags and pouches, there isn't really anything you need to do to prepare the fabric before cutting and sewing. Often when we're making clothing out of natural fiber fabrics like cotton and linen, we need to wash and dry the fabric first to prevent shrinkage. But these technical fabrics and even like waxed canvas are not really meant for the washing machine. I would follow any care guides from the manufacturer if you're uncertain about your fabric at all, but I've never pre-washed woven Cordura, X-Pack, EcoPack before sewing with it. If you are using a natural fiber fabric like canvas or denim, for example, that needs to be washed and dried before sewing with it, I would recommend finishing the raw edges of your fabric with a zigzag stitch, or a serger if you have one. Otherwise, you'll end up with a bunch of fraying threads after washing it, and you'll lose a portion of your usable fabric. So I'm going to show you how to do this in the next video, part 2, when we start talking about machine basics and sewing your first seams. In just a little bit, I'll talk about cutting and marking fabric. So you might be wondering what fabric you should choose for your project. If you're using a pattern, I would first suggest see what the pattern designer recommends. I put fabric recommendations in all of my patterns, and that's a good place to start. Fabric choice really comes down to personal preference. First, figure out what the purpose of the bag you're making is. Is this a small organizing pouch? Is it a crossbody sling or a camera? Is it an ultralight pack for backpacking? Does it need to be waterproof? Does it need any padding? These are all questions to ask when deciding which fabric to buy. Some of the better online companies that sell bag making materials will often list uses for specific fabrics. Most also offer samples, so you can order a sample first and get a feel for whether or not it will work for your project. And I'll link to some of the places that I buy materials below. Keep in mind, the heavier the fabric, the tougher it will be to sew through multiple layers. So your fabric choice in some situations will be dictated by what kind of machine you have and your comfort level sewing with heavier weight materials. All right, let's talk about zippers. They come in a variety of styles and materials. I would recommend using nylon coil zippers for most bags, backpacks, small EDC pouches, at least for a while when you're starting out. There are metal teeth zippers, there are molded plastic tooth zippers like this one, but I pretty much only use nylon coil zipper, and here's why. They can be bought in predetermined lengths like this, or you can buy it in big rolls. You can buy it by the foot or by the yard. And it's really easy to cut either of these. It's economical. Oftentimes you can buy this stuff in big rolls and save some money. And you can simply cut right through it to cut any size of zipper that you need. You can just use scissors, you can use a rotary cutter, and it's really easy to cut this stuff to different sizes. They are also easier to sew directly into seams than other kinds of zippers are, which is a really common bag making technique. You can see I've done that here with this pouch. You can sew this stuff, the nylon coil zippers, right into a seam. It's harder to do that with metal tooth zippers or these bigger molded plastic tooth zippers. It's also really easy to put two opposing zipper pulls on one piece of zipper like this, also known as a two-way zipper. Also something really common with bags because we often want to open the zipper from either side of the bag. They also operate really well when sewn into a curve. So operating a zipper made out of nylon teeth is a lot easier to do. It's just smoother and works really well on a curve. Oftentimes, if the zipper is not like a super high quality zipper, metal tooth zippers can catch a little bit if you try to sew one into a curve. Zippers come in a variety of weights and widths for different uses. Generally, they are measured in millimeters. So this is a 4.5, a number 4.5 zipper because the teeth are 4.5 millimeters across. This is a number 8 zipper because the teeth are 8 millimeters across. The bigger the number, the bigger the teeth, and the more heavy duty the zipper is. If you're buying zipper tape by the yard or foot, you'll need to match the number of zipper tape with the size of the zipper pull. So if you buy a number 8 zipper tape, then you need a number 8 zipper pull. Those two things go together. Like fabric, zippers also have a right and a wrong side. The main way to tell the right and wrong side of your zipper is to just look at the zipper head or the zipper pull. The side where you can grab onto the zipper and open and close it, that's the right side. Don't necessarily look at the zipper teeth because with some nylon teeth zipper tape, the teeth can be installed facing up or the teeth can be installed facing down if you have the right kind of zipper pull. Let's move on to thread. Thread also comes in different materials and weights. Home sewing thread doesn't really have a consistent way of measuring the weight of the thread across different brands or even within the same brand, which can be really frustrating. Throw in the industrial thread numbering system, which sometimes crosses over into the home sewing thread, and it's kind of a mess. To make things simple, as a beginner, I would suggest sticking with thread that's labeled as all-purpose polyester. It's fine for a lot of projects and it's very common and easy to find. All-purpose thread is roughly the same weight or gauge across brands, and it will be easy to sew with on a regular home sewing machine. I've sewn entire backpacks with all-purpose polyester thread, and I haven't had any durability issues. And you can always sew a second layer of stitching with all-purpose thread for extra strength if you want to. Gutermann Thread does a decent job of labeling thread weights with their Mara system. It's M-A-R-A. 100 weight thread like this one being a good all-purpose weight. If you want something heavier, they have a 50 weight thread, which is a little bit stronger. I'm not affiliated with them, but they seem to do a little bit better job of labeling things than some other brands. Later on, with a little bit more experience, you can use some heavier top stitching thread. Top stitching is stitching that appears on the outside of your project and can really make a bag look professional, but it's really not necessary to start with. Thread that you would use on an industrial machine is different. It comes on giant cones like this, and I really wouldn't worry about this kind of thing unless you start buying industrial machines. You can make useful pouches and bags with a regular home-style sewing machine using all-purpose thread. We should talk a little bit about webbing and seam tape now. Webbing can be a really important part of bag making. We use it for straps, handles, various attachment points, and we use seam tape as an option to finish seams. Like fabrics, webbing can be made from natural fibers like this cotton webbing, or synthetic fibers like these nylon, polyester, and polypropylene webbings. I mostly use synthetic webbing made from nylon, but depending on your project and sewing machine, you might choose something different. Different types of webbing can hold more weight than others, and webbings can kind of behave differently when they get wet depending on what they're made out of. Some of them are rough on the outside, like this one. Some of them are really smooth and almost shiny, like this seatbelt webbing. If you're just starting out, the main thing I would consider is the use case for the webbing. Again, what is the purpose of your bag? What kind of sewing machine do you have? This is a really densely woven nylon, and 2 layers of this plus your fabric can be a lot to sew through sometimes. This is actually a heavier weight nylon, but it's softer and it's not quite as dense, and it's actually a little bit easier to sew through. This one here is a really lightweight polypropylene webbing, and it's really easy to sew through. But it's not as strong, and it's not really as abrasion resistant as the nylon is. It's also a little bit rougher on the outside. It might take some experimenting to figure out what works best for the look and functionality you want, and how your sewing machine sews through certain webbings. Just know that there's a lot of options when it comes to webbing. Lastly, I will mention binding tape, sometimes called grosgrain ribbon. This stuff is used a lot in bag making for finishing the raw edges of seams inside bags. If you had a piece of fabric with a raw edge like this, binding tape would just go over the edge and it gets stitched down. You've probably seen this in lots of bags that you've bought. Pretty common technique. This binding tape can also be used as a lightweight option for zipper pulls. Sometimes this will be folded in half and you'll see this at the edge of a zipper, something to grab onto as you open and close the zipper. Let's move on to tools. There are a handful of simple tools that I would suggest having on hand as you get started sewing, and I will link to all of these below in the description. Okay, first up is scissors. You need a pair of scissors to cut your fabric, shorten zippers, and trim your thread tails after you finish sewing a seam. Eventually, you might want a smaller pair like this one to have right at your machine to cut thread tails. Kind of a nice to have, but not totally necessary. If you have an old pair of scissors, I would suggest using those to cut out your paper patterns. Paper really dulls scissors, and you want to keep a nice sharp pair for your fabric that you avoid cutting paper with. Next up is this rotary cutter. A rotary cutter is a nice addition at some point, but not necessary to start. It makes cutting out your fabric much quicker and more accurate than scissors. It has a blade like this, and the blade lowers, and you would use it on a cutting mat like this. So you have to make sure you have a mat like this, but it's a really nice thing to upgrade to at some point. Ruler. Ruler is really nice to have as well. I'm constantly measuring things like the length of a zipper or the seam allowance or maybe even a pocket placement. And I really love to use these clear rulers. Next up is a seam ripper. You will make mistakes. It's part of sewing, and a seam ripper will be your best friend. I use mine constantly. You can use it to take out individual stitches, or you can kind of cut entire seams out with it, but this is a really useful tool to have. Next up is pins or clips. These are essential for holding layers of fabric together as you sew. These are kind of the traditional straight pins, but I really like these clips. They don't distort your fabric like pins do, and you don't poke yourself with them like you can with pins. The last thing is some kind of marking tool, and I really like to use chalk to mark fabric. These little chalk wheels are refillable and work really well. Chalk brushes off of most fabric really easily, and you just make sure to test it on your fabric before you start sewing so that it doesn't stain or bleed onto your fabric. But you can get these little containers and you can refill these, but basically there's a little wheel here and it just puts chalk on whatever you happen to be sewing. All right, let's talk about marking and cutting your fabric. The first thing to consider with fabric cutting is your pattern. Many patterns will have a cutting diagram like this one to help with laying out your fabric for cutting efficiency so you waste less fabric. This pattern has one diagram for the exterior pieces and then another diagram for the interior pieces. This is a roll top backpack pattern that I developed. Your pattern will also have grain lines marked on your pattern pieces. These lines look something like this with 2 arrows. Grain lines are important because fabric can behave and look differently depending on how it's cut. So most fabric has a straight grain line that it runs parallel to the finished edges of the fabric. You can't always see it, but it's there. Cutting parallel to that grain line or the side edge of the fabric is generally the strongest and most stable way to cut your fabric. If you cut against the grain like this, or on the bias like this, the properties of fabric can change and be prone to flex and stretch more. So most pattern pieces will indicate if you should be cutting parallel with the grain, against the grain, or on the bias. So just follow what your pattern designer has indicated on each pattern piece and you should be good to go. If I were to cut a pattern piece with the grain line on this denim, we have finished edge here, we have the grain line that runs parallel to the finished edge, and the grain line on the pattern piece is like this. So I would align the grain line on the pattern piece parallel with the edge of the fabric, and that way I know I'm cutting on the straight of grain. There are a couple of ways to cut fabric. You can lay your pattern on your fabric and pin it down and cut with scissors. So you literally take a pin through the paper into the fabric, and then cut it out. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this. This is how I started out cutting patterns. But for me, the pinning gets a little tedious and the pins can distort your fabric a little bit. If you're cutting your fabric out using scissors, what I would do is I would weigh my fabric down like this, and then I would take the marking tool that I mentioned earlier in the tool section, and you can just trace out your fabric, trace out your pattern piece like so. It takes a little bit more work, but really you don't have to deal with all of the pins. And you want to try to be as accurate as you can here. It's really important with pattern cutting. I'm kind of going quick in this example, but you want to be really accurate. Just trace around the outside of your pattern piece like this. Take off your weights. And then you can use your scissors to cut out the pattern piece. And that way you're just cutting right on the inside of this line so you get the exact shape of the pattern and you don't have any distortion from pins. My favorite way to cut patterns though is with a rotary cutter. And as I mentioned earlier, you need a cutting mat like this under your fabric. But you just weigh your pattern down. I like to use these big washers. You can get them at any hardware store. Weigh your pattern down like this and lower the blade on your cutter. Be careful, these are really sharp and they can move kind of quick. But basically you just weigh your pattern piece down and you cut right along the edge. No pins to deal with. You don't have to chalk out the shape of the pattern in advance. And again, you want to try to be as accurate as you can here. And that's basically all there is to it for cutting out a pattern piece with a rotary cutter. Sometimes in the corners, you still need to just snip the corner a little bit unless you cross over in the corner. If you really get into sewing and making your own gear, which I hope you do, you'll eventually want a rotary cutter, but it's not required when you're just starting. Let's talk a little bit about marking patterns. Sometimes you need to make marks on your fabric for things like pocket placement. Your pattern will indicate where you need to place the pocket, and you would need to transfer those markings to your fabric. I like to use chalk for this, and I have this little hole punch. So let's pretend this is your pattern piece, and it's saying, okay, you need to have the pocket placed right here. I like to punch holes in the corners of the placement markings, and you could cut little marks with scissors if you want to, but what's nice about this is, so I've got one hole in each corner of the pocket placement. And if we need to transfer that to our fabric, kind of pretend that this is like a bigger panel on a backpack or a tote bag, we need to transfer exactly where those pocket markings go. Got holes, and you can just use your chalk a little bit here to mark the dimensions, the placement of that pocket. And sometimes maybe those 4 marks are enough, but if not, it's where this chalk wheel comes in really handy. You can just make these marks right onto your fabric, so we know where pocket is going. And you don't have to put it on quite as heavy, but as an example. And then let's just say this is your actual pocket piece. You wouldn't have this kind of raw zigzagged edge here, but then you know exactly where to put in your fabric. And then let's say this is the finished pocket, and we would just sew this down. So it's helpful to, when you start with the pattern piece, you can punch holes in this, and then you can use that to transfer marks using chalk directly to your fabric. Makes pocket placement really accurate. Lastly, let's talk about notches. Most sewing patterns have notches. These are little marks on your pattern that help you line up different pieces of fabric as you sew. They often look like little triangles like this, and your pattern will probably say something like, align the notch on piece A with the notch on piece B, and then sew your seam. So you would just do exactly that. Align the 2 notches together. Obviously I've got paper here, but just pretend this is fabric. And then, you could pin or clip it together like this, and then run the piece through the sewing machine. The notches are really just there to help you make sure that your pieces are lined up in the right spot before you sew them. You don't have to mark this whole big triangle on your actual fabric. What a lot of people do is, if you have enough seam allowance, you can make just a tiny, like 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch clip into the edge of the fabric where the notch is. Or often what I like to do, if this were my pattern piece, I would just make a little bit of a chalk mark right there. And that's another way that you can mark notches. You would mark these notches on your fabric as you cut out your pattern, and as you are maybe marking other things like I showed you with the pocket placement before. All right, I hope that was helpful. Part 2, where we cover basic machine setup and sewing your first seams, is coming up soon. Feel free to get in touch with any questions you have in the comments below. If I was helpful at all in getting you started on your sewing journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel for more bag making tutorials and patterns. You can also get in touch with me at my website, taylortaylor.com, or on Instagram @taylortaylor. Happy sewing.